Hey everyone, ItsHexical here, and today we're going to be checking out this fancy new keyboard, the Mojo84 from Melgeek Studios. This is a keyboard that has a heavy inspiration from the fashion industry, specifically the Off-White brand that is super popular among the streetwear enjoyers. If you didn't know, I'm personally a huge fashion fan myself and love to explore streetwear fashion, and just by this bright orange box, I can tell this keyboard is going to be an eye catcher. So let's break it open and see if this keyboard is worth the price tag of $229. Inside this box that a hunter could see from a mile away, we have the keyboard itself front and center, which we will be coming back to in a little bit. Moving on from that, we have this nice matching cable, a wireless receiver, and this box which also has a keycap holder, and I assume it was supposed to have extra keycaps, but there wasn't any in mine. I'm also just going to assume that this is going to be fixed with the release keyboards, and this only happened because I have an early release. Going back to the actual keyboard, it's in this nice little bag to protect it, and we also have a ton of peels to do, so let's enjoy this moment together. Now that we have this keyboard all unwrapped, let's go ahead and break down some of the features of the keyboard and what it's got to offer for our hands. The Mojo84 is a 75% hot swap keyboard, which I believe is the perfect mix between functionality and space. The completely transparent case is made out of polycarbonate, and sandwiched between it all there is quite a bit of dampening material, which has a good amount of heft to it, weighing at 950 grams. There are indication lights on the left hand side and even a little Easter egg on the top right, which is super relatable. It also sports a 4000 mAh battery, which lets you use either the 5.2 Bluetooth mode or the 2.4 GHz USB wireless mode. For all the RGB lovers out there, there are RGB functions for this keyboard that can be changed with either hotkeys or via a program, but the lighting is pretty dim in this keyboard. Unless I was in complete darkness, the lighting was not super noticeable and it was pretty mute overall. Unfortunately, the board doesn't support QMK or VIA, and I'll be talking about the software a bit later in the video. Another feature that's in this keyboard and that I'm seeing in a lot of new keyboards is that it does have gasket mounting, which is quite satisfying, and it definitely works as intended, which can't be said about every keyboard that tries to use it. If you don't know what gasket mounting is already, essentially it's where the PCB and plate aren't actually touching the case, and there are silicone gaskets surrounding them to make them float inside of the case. The PCB on this keyboard doesn't have flex cuts in it, so the keyboard isn't ultra flexible or bouncy, but it's more than enough to make me give it a pass. I really can't stand when a keyboard claims to have gasket mounting, but it still feels like a brick, which reminds me about my newest sponsor, Flexispot. Sitting at my desk all day can definitely be cumbersome on my back, and that's where Flexispot can help. Flexispot has a huge range of sit-stand desks available, and I'm using one right here. The controls on it are satisfying and super responsive, and the table itself is really sturdy, like a brick. I trust this table enough to put my giant computer on it, and I stood on it myself with the PC on the desk as well. I know I'm not a huge guy, but I definitely trust this desk when it comes to weight standards. So if you're looking for a new reliable desk, I'd highly recommend checking out Flexispot's lineup of standing desk, or any of their other products that they have. I'll have a link in the description below that supports me, and it saves you some money, so make sure to check it out. Touching back on what is actually inside the keyboard, there is a lot to talk about. First, we have the polycarbonate plate, which has a pour-on mute pad right below it, along with another pour-on switch mat. Then we have the actual PCB assembly itself with a silicone mute pad below it, which encompasses the entire bottom portion of the keyboard. This keyboard just has a ton of pour-on and silicone in it, which not only helps with the elastic/flexy feel, but it makes the sound profile quite deep, and there's definitely not any room for sound to be echoing in there. And if you're wondering, will it thock? The answer is definitely yes with the right switches. Since this keyboard does come completely pre-built, let's talk about the provided keycaps it comes with. I've touched on it before, but a lot of the keyboards that I get that provide keycaps are very underwhelming, and I typically always toss them to the side and forget about them forever. Luckily, I was quite impressed to find that the Mojo84 is rocking some ABS double shot keycaps in their own NDA profile, which I know some are not a fan of, but personally I don't mind. The font and legends on the keyboard are crisp, but are a bit on the larger side, and that may not be for some people. They are actually decently thick and feel comfortable to type on overall. Personally, I think these keycaps are worth keeping on the keyboard, and it helps that the design is almost a perfect match. I'm definitely not a huge fan of the larger font, but that's a very tiny thing compared to the cheap feeling keycaps that I'm used to getting on other budget keyboards. When it comes to your options for switches on the Mojo84, you have two choices. One is a custom Kale switch that Melgeek has made themselves, and then you have the option of Kale Brown switches. I opted for the custom Kale switch, which is a linear switch with a box stem, 35 grams of operating force, and a 3.9mm travel. I looked around online and I really couldn't find any other information online about these switches, which kinda sucks, and it would be nice to know the materials used and everything, and I'm hoping Melgeek will release those soon. They describe the switches sound as gentle sounding, and I think that is a pretty spot on description, but I do find them a bit scratchy personally. I will be having a sound test at the end of this video, so make sure to stick around for that. There isn't any official listing about what stabilizers the Mojo84 is using, but from what I can tell it's using Durock plate mounted stabilizers. Mine did not come with much lube on them, so I'm also under the assumption that they do not come pre-lubed. The Mojo84 does not appear to support any sort of PCB mounted stabilizers, which isn't a huge deal breaker for me now with all the new and improved plate mounted stabilizers in the keyboard market. Unfortunately, the Mojo84 does not support QMK or VIA as I mentioned earlier. One of the major downfalls of a lot of keyboards is the program and software, which is why seeing QMK or VIA being used is a sigh of relief. Melgeek does have its own provided software at least, called KV Tools. While it is definitely not as extensive as something like QMK or VIA, it gets the job done. You can edit all the keys to your individual liking, edit the RGB, set up shortcuts and macros, and you also have some basic settings to adjust things like the Bluetooth name, response time, and sleep timer. You're also able to update the firmware of the keyboard using the program. So while it doesn't support QMK or VIA, the program isn't absolute junk and it allows for enough customization to satisfy my needs. I do still hope that Melgeek looks into putting in QMK or VIA support, but this will work for now. One of the things we definitely can't avoid when talking about this Mojo84 keyboard is the overall aesthetics of it. It's definitely one of the major selling points. Like I mentioned earlier, this design is based off of the off-white fashion line, which is quite popular. It's got this really cool industrial look to it that I am personally a huge fan of, and I think is now one of the most eye-catching boards in my possession currently. I definitely don't think this design is for everybody, and some people are gonna find it off-putting, but this hits a market that really hasn't been tested in the mechanical keyboard community yet, and I think it's gonna work out for them. Personally, I believe the Mojo84 is going to be a great hit. I remember seeing the Mojo64 around, but the community for custom keyboards was a bit smaller then, so I can see this keyboard really blowing up with the community growing so quickly now. I do have some problems with it, like the larger font on the keycaps, the fact that there's only 2 switch options, and that as of right now their specs doesn't list out everything that I would like to know about the keyboard, like what stabilizers they are using, the materials of the switch, and more. Ultimately, all the problems I have found are too small for me to really get upset over, and some of them could be fixed quite easily without even revising the keyboard itself. Just being more transparent with the information about the keyboard, the materials on the switch, and more would make me a lot happier. Considering the keyboard is hot swap and you can change out things quite easily, but it still has everything else that a typical mod would entail, all it takes is a simple switch and stabilizer swap to get the keyboard that you want. I definitely think we're going to be seeing Melgeek a lot more in the future, especially with these crazy designs that they're putting out. I just seen one recently that looks like a Lego keyboard, and I'm actually going to be reviewing it soon, so make sure to keep an eye out for that. So if you're looking for a very eye-catching and pretty fleshed out keyboard for a decent price, then I definitely would be keeping an eye out for this one. The stock sounds of the keyboard are passable, and while I am not a huge fan of the slight scratchiness of the switches, I think just a little bit of lube would make them amazing. So now that we've got pretty much all of this keyboard stuff out of the way, we can finally do a sound test of the stock keyboard. And if you enjoyed this video and you aren't already, make sure to subscribe to my channel and like this video. It helps me out a lot and I always appreciate it. So now let's get into the sound test.